With October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we felt that it was imperative to partner with Julia to get the most important facts and resources available to us local to Bergen County. Today we will be understanding domestic violence, its subtle signs, behaviors to watch out for, and warning signs. I think that it's important that we understand what domestic violence is. So at this point, we're going to hear from Julia. A lot of people may think that they're in a situation or are unsure. So I think it's important that we define what is domestic violence.
So domestic violence is a pattern of behavior designed to exert power and control over another person.
Are there specific warning signs that friends, family, neighbors could look for if they think somebody might be in a domestically violent situation?
Listen, at the end of the day, if you're not sleeping under somebody's bed at night, we really have no idea what's happening in their relationship, what that means in terms of danger or safety or resources or access to resources. I'm the expert on my situation. You're the expert on yours. Survivors of domestic violence are no different. In the beginning of a relationship, when people are dating and courting and want to spend all their time together and they're falling in love with one another and they're in their, little bubble, in hindsight, that could be a warning sign. In real time, that might feel like I'm falling in love. This person's falling in love with me. We're spending all of our time together. So it's a tricky conversation to have because warning sign and hindsight and red flag and falling in love can be a very complicated time.
What are the common signs of domestic violence?
So one of the trickiest parts about domestic violence and abusive relationships is that the way that abusive relationships might present in my office or in a therapist's office is very different, can be very different than how these relationships appear outside in the wild, right, in public. There's a phenomenon known as public face and private face, which is a way that abusers use in order to maintain power and control in an abusive relationship. So including things like, I'm charismatic, I'm well educated, I'm the coach of every team under the sun, I'm the mayor, I'm the sheriff. In public, nobody would ever believe that I'm actually a very different way in private at home. So that public face, private face difference really matters in abusive relationships. It's also part of why many survivors fear that if they disclose what's happening in their relationship, that they won't be believed.
What are some common misconceptions about domestic violence?
So there are a ton of myths out there about abusive relationships, and I welcome anyone who has questions about these or who has their own challenges with something like these to reach out and let's have a conversation about them. Some of the more common ones are, I don't know anybody in an abusive relationship. Or if my partner ever did X, Y, and Z thing, called me this name, put their hands on me, stole from me, sexually assaulted me, did something to my children or in front of my children, I would leave in a heartbeat. Or if somebody's not experiencing physical abuse, then it's not domestic violence.
There are different types of abusive behavior, and it's important that we get across that there are many different types of abuse.
So there are 5 different categories of abusive behavior. As I'm talking about them, you'll hear that each of them are discrete categories unto themselves, but that there's also a lot of crossover in between. As we mentioned, physical abuse is one type of abusive behavior. It does not have to leave marks, and it does not necessarily have to even touch that person to, as I would call it, count, right? Again, we're talking about behaviors that also threaten and intimidate and harass a person, and you can do that without ever laying your hands on somebody else.
A physical reaction in your space.
Correct.
Yeah, so
right.
It doesn't actually have to physically touch you. It's just intimidating you by physically touching something, putting it in your direction. It's just that whole entire situation.
Right. Financial abuse is another big one. And I think that financial abuse is something that a lot of people may be less familiar with. Financial abuse, I think, is something super relevant to be talking about in an area like Bergen County, where we have a variety of socioeconomic status. Some examples of financial abuse would include things like keeping somebody on an allowance, not giving somebody full access to bank accounts, credit cards. Sexual abuse is another big category here, including things like certainly forcing a survivor to participate in sexual acts that are being done to the survivor being forced to perform sexual acts on their partner or a third party, forced PDA, all the way up to and including things like sexual assault and rape. Verbal abuse is another big category. So verbal abuse could include things like name calling, shouting, yelling, screaming, but also the opposite of shouting, yelling, screaming, talking in a really low, controlled, calm voice and looking somebody dead in the eye and letting them know how disappointed you are in them can sometimes send chills up and down a person's spine in a way that yelling and screaming may not. And last but not least, emotional and psychological abuse. So again, I said these are all discrete categories unto themselves, but there's a lot of overlap in between. Emotional and psychological abuse could also be very similar to verbal abuse, like I was just describing. Name calling, criticizing somebody's parenting, somebody's education or lack of education, gaslighting. It's meant to leave a survivor not knowing which way is up. What are my preferences? Who are my friends? How do I get dressed in the morning? What kinds of foods do I like to eat? What color is the sky actually? It's a form of psychological power and control, manipulation, where a person is literally left feeling like they're powerless.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you to our viewers for joining us in this very important conversation. Join us next week as we discuss the impacts of abuse. If you or somebody that you know is experiencing domestic violence, don't hesitate to seek help.